Hello, everybody. I'm delighted you could join us today. I am the Executive Director of the Equality Trust. My name is Dr. Zubaida Haque, and it's wonderful to have you all here. Turning up is quite important. It shows that you care about this issue. It shows that structural inequalities is an important part of us discussing inequalities, and hopefully we have the program that you're looking for. We definitely have a packed program. We have amazing speakers, and I will be telling you a little bit more about those speakers as we go along. But first of all, I just thought we'd start off with a brief introduction, if you like, about Structural Inequalities Seminar. Now, you may or may not know that these webinars are actually part of the Structural Inequalities Alliance, which was brought together a little over a year ago. We have 15 or more organizations. We're represented by, we have memberships that includes us. The Equality Trust is the Secretariat and I'm the chair, but it includes the CBI, Resolution Foundation, Oxfam, Women's Budget Group, Mental Health Foundation, Black Equity Organization, and many, many, many others. And I'll tell you a little bit more about why we've come together and why today and webinars like today's are important. But I want to start with a bit of context, if you like, a bit of background around inequality and structural inequality. And it will come as no surprise to you to say that quite a lot has changed in the last 10 years with regards to inequality, and especially structural inequalities. What do I mean by structural inequalities? Well, what I mean by structural inequalities is not only those persistent inequalities over a long period of time, but also those intersectional inequalities, those inequalities between different groups. And it's those compounding, persistent and intersectional inequalities that means that inequalities remain entrenched. And of course, it remains entrenched because we haven't addressed that, but more about that later, and definitely more about that from our speakers. As I said, much has changed over the last decade, and that's partly a combination of sustained austerity measures, which have pushed both local authorities, specific groups, and country really tight corner, but making particular groups really much worse off. It's been a result of a sustained squeeze on wages, if you like, stagnating wages, and we've had a shrinking social security safety net. And all of those are really important issues, in particular, of course, the issue about safety net, which concerns the Structural Inequalities Alliance, among other issues, quite a lot. And that's because at the moment, we have a government that's slightly resistant to using the social security safety net. And that's been particularly stark at the moment in terms of the cost of living crisis. Thankfully, the Chancellor has come to his senses and will be using those targeted benefits to help those income groups that are those income groups who are the poorest or who are at the sharp end of inequality. But I think a broader conversation needs to be had about the social security safety net, whether it's adequate, whether it's comprehensive, and whether everyone who needs to access it can access it. Anyway, as I mentioned, inequality is rising up the agenda. But when I talk about inequality, we have to be clear about what kinds of inequality we've been talking about. Much of the political debate in the last several years has really been around what we call vertical inequality. And that's about individuals. That's about one individual, regardless of what group they belong to, either faring less well or better than their neighbour. But what we're interested in Structural Inequalities Alliance is also what we call the horizontal inequality, the inequality between groups who, by their very nature, by membership of the groups that they're in, gender, race, disability, sexual orientation, trans status, class, by the mere nature of being in those groups, are much more disadvantaged, not just much more, but disadvantaged in very different ways. And we need to think about that. We need to think about that because structural inequalities, as I mentioned, isn't just about those persisting long-term inequalities, it's also about those inequalities across the groups. And on top of that, I think I also want to mention the issue that intersectionality is nuanced. And some of that will come out today from our speakers, but some of that also needs to be acknowledged beforehand. And what I mean by that, about intersectionality being nuanced, or at least us thinking about intersectional inequality as nuanced, is because different issues affect different groups in different ways. We're going to be talking about housing a little bit today, and we have Osama Bhutta, who's the Director of Campaigns Policy and Comms at Shelter, who will be talking about housing and how that affects structural inequalities. But that's a good example of where we know that housing costs are the highest for particular Black and ethnic minority groups, particular in the sense that it's particularly for Black groups, for mixed groups. And that's important because it explains some of the extremely high child poverty rates among those groups. And that's why nuance is important. But nuance is also important because all the statistics and all the discussions that we've had recently fail to capture the housing costs and the living costs and the living challenges for disabled groups. And today we have Celia Hensman, who's the co-founder and director of the Disability Policy Centre. And Celia will be talking to us about the impact of living crisis and COVID-19 on structural inequalities and what a new normal should look like for disabled groups. We also need to think about how we go from here. If we take the living standards, cost of the living standards and what's happening at the moment, we know that there are many, many challenges. We know where the policy gaps are. Up until recently, the Chancellor has chosen universal solutions and universal measures at the expense of lower income households. That's not been satisfactory at all. He is changing that, and I've heard of some of his measures today. It's all a step in the right direction, but it's not enough. And it's not enough because it's not just the Chancellor's responsibility to see what we can do about structural inequalities. It's everyone's responsibility. And that's why we have Helen Flynn with us today, who is the head of policy research and campaigns from Just Fair. And Helen Flynn will be talking to us about what more local authorities can do at the moment and in the future in terms of addressing structural inequalities. We also have two other topics to be discussed today, and that will be money and mental health. Now that, of course, is particularly pertinent in the context of the cost of living crisis, but it's also about wider issues around money and mental health stress and how people cope and what more we can do. And today we have Helen Undy, who is the Chief Executive of Money and Mental Health, joining us. And last but not least, and she won't be last, we have Olivia, who is a campaigner for the no recourse to public funds. Olivia will be talking to us today about immigration policy, living standards, and structural inequalities. And what Olivia will be particularly highlighting is how there are groups in society at the moment who can't access the safety nets that are out there, who are deliberately excluded and who are constantly overlooked, and what that means for them in terms of living standards, in terms of dignity, and in terms of long-term equality. So we have a packed agenda. So without any further ado, there's a lot more to say around structural inequalities. I do have one more thing to say, sorry. I have one more thing to say because I want to say that with the Structural Inequalities Alliance, that's why we are having these regular webinars. We're having these regular webinars. We had one in January on levelling up This one's on the cost of living standards, cost of living crisis. And we are doing these regularly because what we're really conscious of is that many of the solutions at the moment are either crisis-led or they are about particular aspects of inequality rather than structural inequalities. And what we want to do as a group, we're a very unique group, which is obvious when you think about the fact that we have CBI, we have businesses, we have think tanks, we have charities, we have women's groups. We're a very unique group because structural inequalities is everybody's problem. So anyway, without any further ado, let's start because we're already behind time. Apologies, everybody. Let's start with our first speaker, Osama Bhutta, who is the Director of Campaigns, Policy and Communications. Osama is Glasgow born, and he's won campaigns, persuaded audience, influenced governments, and built growth in his work from all over the world. Osama, would you like to talk to us about housing, living standards, and structural inequalities? Over to you.
Thanks, Zubaida, and good afternoon, everybody. It's really good to be with you and to talk about this important subject. I'm going to kick this off with mentioning something which many of you might not have heard of. Is a company called Bored Ape. I mean, hands up if anyone has heard of them, but they were in the news a few weeks ago because they did a float on the metaverse, which I think there'll be more familiarity with, where they were selling land and property online. So you go into this new place that people like Mark Zuckerberg are setting up, and you can buy property. And what's happening is the entire generation is having been frozen out of decent housing or now living out fantasy lives online. And the prediction is that this is going to increase as a trend. So $500 million was spent on online property last year. It's predicted to double this year. And that Bored Ape offering brought in $300 million. And that isn't just, there are people with more money than sense involved in that, but there are also people, young people who, are living in dingy apartments, let to them by shoddy landlords, can't get access to decent social housing, and are living out whatever they can, wearing VR goggles and trying to live out lives online. And our belief at Shelter, and I'm sure everyone in this call will agree, is that we want people to be able to live good lives here in the real verse. Home is everything. It's a platform for everything. If you get home right, children can get the education that they have a right to. People feel the platform to go and get further education, skills, thrive in employment, not feel that pressure of the next paycheck, meaning that they might get evicted from the property, and that's the dignity with which in which all our citizens should live. And instead, structurally, what we've created over the last 10 years is strange concepts, alien concepts a few years ago, like food banks, and in sense of housing, this idea of temporary accommodation has become normalized. But it's just another word for homelessness. 250,000 people in this country are homeless, including 120,000 children. This is an indictment on a country with the history and wealth that this country has. That this remains the case. 1.6 million people are on the waiting list for social housing. Social housing used to be something this country excelled in after the Second World War, and got our people out of slums and slum conditions and gave them dignity. We in the last number of decades, we've stripped that away from people. So we need to get back to this, and the equilibrium will be set by a number which is agreed across the sector, that as a country, we need to build 90,000 social homes every single year, social homes which are truly affordable as a percentage of people's incomes. We need to be less sheepish, even as a housing sector. As a housing sector, actually, we've lowered our expectation. We don't say this loudly enough. And at Shelter, we are determined that we're going to be making this argument in the coming months and years in coordination with partners. But this needs to be front and centre of this debate about the future of this country, because they can't be levelling up if people are housing insecure and who are in fear of being evicted. So yes, let's talk about the other infrastructure like trains and all the rest of it, but the real infrastructure is in people's homes. When we're thinking about putting money back in people's pockets, it's good to talk about the energy bills and all the rest of it that's rising, but as a proportion of people's income, go for the biggest items. And the biggest items are the exorbitant rent that so many people are paying for substandard properties. Let's get to the heart of that. Make housing much more affordable than it is now, and in effect, you end up with something. Universal basic housing is as applicable as universal basic income. In the foundation that it will give our people. So yeah, I'll leave my remarks there and back over to you, Zubaida.
Thank you so much. Now I'm going to use my chair's prerogative before we move on to the next speaker, partly because I'm conscious of time, Osama, to ask you a question now before you leave us, so you don't get away. You do not get away without answering some of our questions. And of course, if the audience have anything that they urgently want to ask Osama, please write the question right now while I ask Osama this question, which is, it's absolutely scandalous, really. It's a national scandal when you see the figures that you've mentioned, the 250,000 people who are homeless, the 1.6 million on waiting lists, and how you, of course, interestingly mentioned that, you can't be levelling up if people are in insecure homes. So can I just ask you, in terms of policy levers at the moment, and in the context of the Queen's speech recently, are there any policies, let's look at it from a positive angle, are there any policies at the moment that this government could use to tackle some of those growing housing inequalities? That's the first question. And I suppose the second one is we've talked very broadly, but are there specific groups that you're really worried about?
Yeah, we're worried about major groups. And you mentioned in your introductory remarks, I think there is an underreported and under-researched element of this where people with Black and ethnic minority backgrounds are disproportionately affected. But I mean, we're worried in the round. I mean, the numbers I quoted you are before the pandemic restrictions were lifted late last year. So we think the numbers have gone up, and even the government's figures last week showed that evictions in the first 3 months of this year were up 41% compared to pre-pandemic. So there seems to be a glut of evictions happening, and we're very worried about what this means, because that is going to unfortunately lead to a rise in homelessness, and we're bracing ourselves for the evidence of that. So what can government do? Actually, there was a lot to commend in the Queen's speech the other week. So the government had promised a ban on Section 21 eviction, so landlords cannot willy-nilly just evict people from their homes. A proper landlord's register with decent standards enforced, all to the good, and some enabling legislation as well, and reforms of planning, which will allow social homes to get built. But the big one is to get those social homes actually built. It's going to require an uptick in investment, which it sounds like a lot of money, but in the grand scheme of things, actually, for the government, it's very affordable. We've just got to make the really vigorous, determined argument and demand that they do it, and then hopefully we're very confident that it can and will have a massive impact for the people in this country.
Thank you very much, and thank you for letting me use my chair's prerogative there. Right, hopefully Osama will stay with us for a little bit longer to hear our other speakers. Our next wonderful speaker is Helen Undy, who is the Chief Executive of Money and Mental Health. And Helen leads Money and Mental Health, in particular with a mission in mind, and that's to build a world in which the vicious cycle of money and mental health problems is broken. Now, at the moment, of course, it'll be foremost on a lot of people's minds because we're in the cost of living crisis. But actually, the pandemic and many other crises, austerity policies, every time these crises happen, this is an issue. But it's also an issue for many families throughout. And that's the point of this webinar. Let me tell you a little bit about Helen's background. She has significant experience working across the third sector and in policy and politics. And she previously led Mind's policy and campaigns work on public mental health and social care, campaigning with young care leavers and people who are homeless. Helen, without any further ado, but please,
I'm here. Thank you very much. Brilliant. So for those people who don't know our organisation, the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute, we are a research and campaigning organisation rooted in the lived experiences of people with mental health problems. So we have a research community of just over 4,000 people who share their experiences with us every week and are at the heart of all of our research. And I'm in a very privileged position to run the organisation with a really inspiring team of researchers and campaigners. I'm going to share my screen with you and show you a couple of slides, but if you are the sort of person that would rather watch a face while you're listening to something, you're not going to miss out fundamentally if you do that. So, so do feel free to switch off the slides if they're not your thing. So can you see my slides? You can, fantastic. Let me. Great, this now means that I can't see you. So if something goes fundamentally wrong, please shout rather than put your hand up because I can't see your faces anymore. So I'm going to talk very briefly through two things. So firstly, why people with mental health problems are more likely to have poor living standards. So to have low living standards before the pandemic, through the cost of living crisis, and basically for decades into the past as well. And then I'm going to reflect very briefly on why people in poverty are more likely to have mental health problems, because the structural inequalities here cut both ways, and it's important to understand both of them. And then I'm going to finish with a very quick note on some of those intersectional inequalities that affect different groups. So why people with mental health problems are more likely to be on low incomes and have low living standards and be living in debt. I mean, the thing that most obviously comes to mind is income. So I'm going to focus on the three. So for those people who are looking at the slides, there's three columns here. The first is a set of things that happen when we experience mental health problems, from connected relationship difficulties, physical health problems, difficulties with the way that our minds work, so the way we process information, the way we communicate. All of those things can lead to these three outcomes, which are that our income goes down, our spending goes up, and our ability to manage our money is reduced. So it is no wonder that you're 3.5 times as likely to be in problem debt if you're living with a mental health problem. So very briefly, income goes down. Only 43% of people with mental health problems are in employment. Those figures were from pre-pandemic, when the last set of figures with a mental health angle came out. It is likely to have got worse since then, and that's compared to 74% of the general population. So there's a big employment gap there between people with mental health problems and people without. Our research found an average gap of about £8,500 per year on household income as a result of mental health problems. So when you are unwell, your income is likely to be lower and sustained at a lower point long into the future. You're also more likely to be living on benefits. So 2/3 of employment and support allowance claimants have mental health problems. Nearly half of people on any form of out of work benefits have mental health problems. So when benefit levels don't keep pace with inflation, when benefits are cut, when people are sanctioned, that is disproportionately affecting people with mental health problems, kind of sustaining and really embedding that gap between incomes between those with mental health problems and those without. Equally, where we see really low levels of sick pay, that is disproportionately affecting people with mental health problems. So income is down. Expenditure is likely to be higher, both because of higher costs and because of difficulties controlling and managing spending. So 93% of people in our research said their spending is higher when they're struggling with their mental health. And ability to manage money is reduced. So 3/4 of people with mental health problems struggle to use one common communication channel like telephone, online, emails, letters, which means it's really hard to ask for help and to talk to your bank. And all of these things interact and make each other worse. Financial difficulties. So the impact of financial difficulties on our mental health can be immediate and direct, and that is this blue arrow on the slide for people who are looking at that diagram. So being in debt makes us feel guilty, anxious, angry, frustrated, and there is a really direct link there. But also some of the other things that happen to us when we're in debt can affect our mental health. So that includes the indignity of going without essentials, and by essentials that could be turning off your heating or not getting your kids a new school uniform, or it could be not being able to afford the bus, which means that you don't get to see your friends, or you can't go swimming, which is the thing that might help your mental health. We also see financial difficulty leading to what we're calling in here creditor action, but I basically mean debt collection. And debt collection has a very significant and immediate impact on our mental health. So particularly during the cost of living crisis, we are stepping up our asks on firms, regulators and government to improve debt collection standards to make sure that the impact it's having on people's mental health is managed. I'm not going to talk through the rest of these because we don't have time to go through all of them in depth, but I'm very happy to come back to them if people would like to later. So what that leads to is this cycle. Financial difficulty drives mental health problems drive financial difficulty. Those structural inequalities compound and exacerbate each other. That is made worse by the cost of living crisis. And then just finally, because I know I need to wrap up, I didn't want to not touch upon some of those intersecting inequalities. This is an awful lot worse for some groups of people. So where I talked about that employment gap, there is an employment gap of 12% between white people and people from an ethnic minority background. So if you are from an ethnic minority background and you are living with mental health problems, those issues are compounded. Equally, people are likely to face discrimination both on the basis of mental health and on the basis of their ethnicity, which can make employment even harder. Similarly, prevalence of mental health problems is higher amongst some ethnic minority groups, particularly Black, to be lower. So people who are from white groups are much more likely to access mental health services. So those inequalities get worse, and we find ourselves in an even tighter spiral of mental health problems and financial difficulty as those other inequalities are layered and compound each other. That was a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so that I can see you, but I'm happy to talk through any of the rest of it later on in the questions.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Helen. Those slides were very, very thought-provoking, actually, I think, in terms of seeing how that vicious cycle, if you like, keeps happening and where we need to step in. And hopefully we can ask you a bit more about that. Mary, I know you've got your hands up, but we're going to go through a few more speakers. If you could put your question in the chat, that would be brilliant. Or just if you could just wait until the end of all the speakers, we will be taking on your question. Thank you so much, Mary. Right, our next speaker is Celia Hensman, who's the co-founding director of the Disability Policy Centre. Celia is as I mentioned, she's the founder, the director of the Disability, co-founder, the director of the Disability Policy Centre. She has multiple disabilities herself, including the Louise Dietz syndrome. I know I've said that wrong. I'm so sorry. Marfan's and POTS. And most significantly, Celia lives with a permanent central line in her chest, receiving daily blood infusions and complete artificial nutrition. Life is not easy for Celia, but she has never known a life without her disability. And consequently, from a very young age, Celia has had to be and has warmly taken up the issue of being an active disability rights campaigner. Today, Celia will be joining us to talk about the impact of disability in the context of COVID and the cost of living crisis, but more broadly to talk about it in the context of structural inequalities and how our society has had the same barriers for disabled groups time and time again. and of course what we can do. So over to you, Celia.
Thank you, Zubaida. Just for those who don't know about the Disability Policy Centre, we are the first and only think tank in the UK which works exclusively talking about disability and accessibility and increasing the conversation in Parliament about those issues. To kind of kick off, I think the biggest structural inequality that the disability community is facing is this real battle between the medical model of disability and the social model of disability. So for those that don't necessarily know the difference or haven't heard that before, I'll describe it very, very briefly. The medical model of disability, which arguably is what we're living under at the moment, dictates that as a result of your disability, you are disabled. And I know that sounds like a very odd thing to say, but it's to say, you know, you can't run a marathon because you're in a wheelchair. You can't access the cinema because you have a hearing impairment or you have a visual impairment. It's to say that your disability is the cause of why you are suffering through the structural inequalities that we have in our country. One of the big things that we argue for, and the disability community is especially arguing for, is more of a move towards this social model of disability. And what the social model of disability dictates is that, yes, obviously there are negatives about having a disability and there are limitations physically, mentally, neurologically, whatever it may be. But it's to say we are living in a world that is not built for disabled people. We are living in a world that is not accessible for disabled people. So if we take the cinema, for example, how we operate under the medical model is that you cannot participate in that activity if you have a visual impairment or if you have a hearing impairment. What we're trying to say is that we need to move to this proactive environment for disabled people where we're putting in place the accessibility measures that people need. When we're designing buildings, it shouldn't be an afterthought of, oh, we need to put a ramp in, we need to put a hearing loop in, what can we do for disabled people? We should just be doing it. And by doing these things, by addressing the accessibility of the built environment around us, disabled people are going to be more included within society. And that's not out of pity, that's not out of sympathy, it's utilizing the talents and potentials that disabled people have, which currently we aren't doing. So this move towards the social model is a very background context of what it is in a very succinct manner, is at the root of the causes of the structural inequalities that we have in this country for disabled people. Disabled people in the UK is the largest minority group. It's over 20%, and I think it stands at something like 21% right now. But you know, for a lot of people, that statistic is not very accurate because it's all about personal identification. Lots of people choose to identify as having a disability, and lots of individuals who have long-term health conditions, whether that be a mental health condition, a neurodiversity, a physical condition, may choose not to identify with that label. But if we're taking official statistics, it's the largest minority group in the UK. But we are one of the most vulnerable and hard-hit groups in the UK. And why is that happening? It all links back to this social versus medical model of disability. And one of the greatest problems as to why this is happening is there is a real culture of people being spoken on behalf of. It's a lack of the disabled voice being involved within the conversation at the core of where our policy and where our terms of being dictated of how we live in this country is being produced. And it's about making sure that we are not being spoken on behalf of. We're not being told what we want, what we need. It's disabled people being effectively consulted and telling you what we need. It's not for the other way around. Disability is infinitely and beautifully diverse, and no two individuals are the same. So it's vital that when we're talking about disability and when you're representing disabilities, that we include everybody across that spectrum, from non-visible to visible to neurological to mental health conditions, that we're including everybody in that conversation. And it goes back again to, we're very much living in a world which is very reactive, it's not proactive. So we're waiting for the discrimination to happen before we address the issue. We're waiting for the vulnerable people in our society to sink to the lowest of the lowest, to be tackling the most awful living conditions, to be tackling the most awful social conditions before we do something. We need to be doing something now to protect people in the future. If we look at environmental issues around us, if we look at financial issues around us, if we look at you know, the improvement in medical care, the number of disabled people in this country is just going to rise, and it's going to rise very, very quickly as our population ages. And there's this real misconception that, you know, I'm not disabled, so it doesn't affect me. We are all going to grow old. We are all going to come across at some point in our lives some kind of various medical condition. If we look at the statistics, awfully for cancer at the moment, 1 in 2 of us are going to get cancer in our lifetimes. When you are battling cancer, you fall under that bracket of having a disability or a long-term health condition, and you may need measures in place to help you if you're unable to work, if you're unable to provide for your family, whatever it may be, that there's this real incorrect insular attitude that it doesn't apply to me, and it only applies to those that are wheelchair users, or they have a hearing impairment, they have a vision impairment, and that's something that we really need to address. And at the core of policy, disability does not just relate to health and social care, and that's such a misconception. Disability relates to everything. It affects our entire lives, and that's one of the biggest ways that we can tackle structural inequalities for disabled people, is putting disabled people in the conversation at every aspect of policy, and not just in health and social care. And just kind of touching on what Zubaida said about COVID is,
thank you.
Oh, sorry, I'll finish there and we can talk about it later.
No, thank you, Celia, so much. I'm sorry, I just had to cut you off at the end there, but I do want to bring in the others, and I want to bring you back into this conversation, because you made such important points about, especially the point, I think, about how we are crisis-led and reactive-led, and how much of when you look at what's happened in relation to COVID-19 and how we've changed some things in terms of making it easier for disabled groups to be able to participate in the labour market. But it's been a short-term solution, and it's been a solution that's based in people's homes. So actually employers and labour markets haven't really changed that much, other than just simply saying, well, you can work from home. And that simply is not changing the built environment. And there's lots of other great issues that you've raised that we'll come back to. Now, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to speed ahead. Osama, are we going to lose you in a minute, or will you be able to stay longer?
No apologies, I'll need to drop off in a minute, but it's been really good being here.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. I think you've raised some really important points, and hopefully you'll come back again and join us again. So everybody, thank you to Osama. And right, I'm going to, without any further ado, move on to our next amazing speaker, who is Olivia, who's a campaigner with the No Recourse to Public Funds Action Group. And it's fantastic that Olivia could join us today, because one of the things that we've all been really conscious of in the Structural Inequalities Alliance is how there are entire groups in society who are completely overlooked. We can talk about social security, we can talk about all the different ways, including all the different ways the Chancellor is helping out. But new migrants who have no recourse to public funds, which means basically that they can't access social security, they can't work necessarily straight away. There are so many barriers there. Means that that group find it very difficult to climb out of poverty, they find it very difficult to get proper work and so on. But I'm going to hand over to Olivia, because Olivia will be able to take us through that journey and talk to us a little bit more about immigration policy, living standards, and structural inequalities. Olivia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Zubaida, and good afternoon, everyone. As Olivia from the NRPF Action Group, supported by Praxis. I would like to speak to you about the structural inequality, as mentioned, the no recourse to public funds when it is on your visa. This policy prevents people from accessing the mainstream benefits in the welfare system, especially when they are mostly needed. So people are denied access to a welfare safety net. The policies targets migrant communities who are mostly people of color, and reinforces the existing structural inequalities it disproportionately affects the single parents, children of color, people with disabilities, and those who are undocumented. And those who are affected and the entire families end up into cycles of poverty, homelessness, and children are going hungry. So living under these unsafe conditions disregards people's dignity as normal human beings. Most migrants are on a 10-year route to permanent settlement here in the UK. And this means that they are given only a limited leave to remain, which is 30 months. So they've got to renew every 30 months until they make the 10 years. This means that they've got to work really hard and be able to save the renewal fees, the visa renewal fees. And these are really very high. They're just extortionate fees, and they're to be paid to the Home Office. One application will be over £2,000, and this can be like over 30,000 for a family over a period of 10 years. So the same migrants who have no access to the safety net have to work really hard to save all this money. So there's no guarantee for accessing the local authority housing support, no guarantee for childcare, and this forces mothers to end up in abusive relationships. The only way you can access domestic violence refugee is if you have the local authority housing support. Parents have to struggle to find quality family time, and children are missing out on proper support, including school homework. The children lack confidence in themselves and do not feel the real sense of belonging to the societies where they live. Parents cannot afford school trips and even, in most cases, school uniforms. So this instability really affects children's education and mental health, and the parents have to live in constant stress and anxiety. And in all these ways, this NRPF policy on your visa is harming a lot of people. We recently won a campaign so that children whose parents have the no-recourse public fund could access the free school meals. This is a first positive step, but we have some questions for further research on this issue. And now currently, as everyone knows, the cost of living has gone up. This is a situation that has not been encountered for good decades, but this is it. With all the bills, food prices, and the NI contribution and council tax all increasing, a lot of families will experience severe mental health. And for people with NRPF condition on their visas, it means further precarious situation. So how can we survive? I'm just calling for a fairer society to all. This NRPF policy should be ended. We will be launching a campaign to get all the routes to permanent settlement to the UK to 5 years. And we would love everyone on this call, everyone in this space, to join us and support our campaign to call and to our campaign to reduce the settlement route to only 5 years. Solidarity, solidarity, solidarity. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Olivia. That was incredibly powerful. Yeah, I mean, really powerful. It's rendered me a bit speechless. But I wanted to just say before we go on to the next speaker that one of the words that Olivia used is a really important word for us to remember, and that's belonging. And we talk a lot about inequality and diversity and inclusion. But if we don't talk about belonging and what it means to belong and how it's impossible to belong if you don't have financial security, and as Olivia pointed out, if you are trapped in so much financial obligations and debt, it's an extraordinary figure that one application costs over £2,000 per year, let alone what it means for a family over a long time. Then how can you feel that you belong in society when all the messages are from the government, because of their no recourse to public funds policy, which I agree with, Olivia, needs to be scrapped? How can you feel you belong? Anyways, thank you, Olivia. Thank you so much. Hopefully you'll stay with us. And actually, I say that, but I know you're going to go at 3. So Helen, forgive me while I just hold you back just for a second, Helen Flynn. But I wonder, does anybody here have any questions for Olivia? And if not, does anybody have any questions? Speak now, otherwise I will get in there. Olivia,
maybe I might just say one thing, which
please.
To me. And now with the Nationality and Borders Act, because it's not a bill anymore, it's going to be like the refugees will be now grouped into groups, and the second group, those who are not coming through the government like settlement scheme, they will have the NRPF action like policy on their visas. So what is the way forward if we are already suffering? And it's just going to be, what can we do? This is the best space I think we can all think about what can be done, and we try and fight yes, thank you.
And fight together, Olivia. I think that's a really important thing. And I think you've mentioned that really there's no tweaking to be done here. We don't want to tweak the no recourse to public funds. It is a completely inappropriate, it is a wholly unsatisfactory policy that is designed to marginalize groups, keep them from entering society, from belonging in society. And as Olivia powerfully shared with us, it can just devastate. It devastates families and pushes them into so many crisis situations. So Olivia, thank you so much. If people want to stay in touch with Olivia, she's a campaigner and part of the No Recourse to Public Funds Action Group, which is facilitated by Praxis. Praxis are a fantastic group out there. They work very hard with new migrants. They've done lots of work with new migrants and particularly migrant women. So please support them and please do stay in touch with Olivia. And Olivia, I know you have to go in 5 minutes. Stay with us until then, but thank you so much. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Helen, you have waited patiently. You have waited so patiently, and it's not the last but not least, we're really excited about Helen Flynn, who's the head of policy research and campaigns from Just Fair, joining us today, because Helen is the head of, not only is she the head of policy research and campaigns at Just Fair, but she's got quite an extensive background working with NGOs, and she's worked quite a lot in terms of building a fairer and more just UK through the better realization of economic, social and cultural rights. Helen's joining us today because she's going to talk to us. She's going to talk to us about what more local authorities can do to address structural inequalities and to address issues like the cost of living crisis in the long term. We're not interested just in the short term. And specifically what Helen and Just Fair, who the Equality Trust are working very closely with, what Helen's going to talk to us is about the socioeconomic duty and what more local authorities can do in terms of adopting the socioeconomic duty. I'm not going to say much more because you say it much better than I do, Helen. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And I have absolutely no problem waiting when I'm coming after such wonderful presentations. So thank you to all the previous speakers. This has been wonderful to be part of. As Zubaida kindly said in her introduction, my name is Helen Flynn. My contact details are here, but if anybody does want to get in touch, I'm sure that the Equality Trust would be happy to circulate my details. And also these slides, because I'm aware that slides cannot be read by screen readers. So if anybody has access problems, I will try not to rely on the slides, but also the slides will be circulated afterwards if people would like that. I'm sure the Equality Trust won't mind me just jumping in and saying that can be done. So my first slide, I just want to set the scene a little bit about why Just Fair care about the socioeconomic duty, as Zubaida mentioned, and why we're really involved in that campaign and co-lead it with the Equality Trust. This slide is not current. It's a snapshot from March because things have got much worse once again since then. But this was part of the evidence we submitted to the United Nations Human Rights Council in terms of what's going on in the UK back in March. And you'll notice from some of these statistics, I'll not run through them because I have 5 minutes. You can see that the cost of living crisis is something that's impacting upon different groups in very different ways. So I think that final statistic that 62% of working age people referred to food banks in early 2020 were disabled, which is over 3 times more than the general working age population, is incredibly telling. There is a cost of living crisis, but it is not impacting all of us in the same way. And for Just Fair, we take this from the angle that as a human rights organisation, we see the cost of living crisis as a human rights issue. And in particular, we would see each individual person and the communities they are part of as rights holders. And when their rights are denied or are violated, then that is something that we need to hold the duty bearers to account for. And the duty bearers in this case often are the UK government or the public authorities. So rather than seeing this as something that's just randomly happening, our starting point would be that this is a human rights issue, that individuals and the communities they're part of have human rights, and human rights should be about recognising people in all their diversity and ensuring that they live lives of dignity and lives in which they can flourish and reach their potential. So if that's not being met, then for us, we're looking at human rights violations. So that's our starting point. And we're not entirely negative about what's going on, though. We do think that stuff can be done. But just to link in firstly to how this links with inequality, I've basically hands up stolen this slide from the Equality Trust work. And the point of this slide is that we all know equality or inequality is bad, and we know that poverty is bad. But just to take it from a different angle, this is based on some research conducted by Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson in the Spirit Level. It shows that around the world, when we compare issues such as infant mortality, violent crime, physical and mental health, and education outcomes, these all get worse in societies with higher rates of inequality. So it's not about the income in the societies where these issues get worse, it's about the inequality that exists internally within these societies. So if you want to take a very selfish point of view on inequality, it also would be that it hurts us all. So not just those who are economically excluded. So no matter what your starting point for wanting to reduce and tackle inequality is, it's something that we should all be worried about. And then just to touch quickly on the socioeconomic duty, because I haven't got much time left, there is something that exists that we could use to tackle some of these inequalities, and it's called the socioeconomic duty. The socioeconomic duty is part of the Equality Act 2010. I've put the text up on screen again, I'll send the slides around. And what it does is it requires public authorities to consider how the exercise of their powers can reduce inequality. It's very similar to the public sector equality duty in section 149 of the Act. But the problem is that while the Equality Act obviously has come into force, this part of the duty, which is designed to reduce inequalities, has not been commenced. So it is in force in Scotland, it's in force in Wales because they've both decided to bring it in themselves. But the UK government currently, and for the past 12 years, has not enacted it. But we are seeing a growing number of local authorities in England undertaking activities designed to tackle socioeconomic disadvantage and actually voluntarily adopting the duty. And just last night, I'm delighted to say that Derby joined that growing list of local authorities. There's a huge range of benefits to local adoption. And as I said, the Equality Trust and Just Fair do lead on a campaigning group that's designed to ensure national adoption and also support local adoption. But one of the really powerful things that I just really want to highlight in the time I have left is that it's really about considering in all your policies, in all the decisions you're making, about what the impact is on those people with multiple characteristics, including those experiencing the sharpest ends of poverty. And that in itself, just for staff and decision makers to be considering that and to be hearing firsthand from those people experiencing it, is an incredibly powerful tool. So if anybody wants to hear more about this, ask me questions, or please do get in touch, because I could talk about this for hours, but I do want to leave it there because I don't want to abuse my time.
Thank you so much, Helen. You definitely didn't abuse your time. And that was such a useful conclusion in a way to our speakers, because not only is it about the fact that, I mean, we know inequality is a long game. We know it's a long game. We know it's systemic. We know that it's complex. But I think what's really important, especially when it comes to structural inequalities and how you tackle it, is to see what are the achievable things that we can do. And so what Helen has done right now is taken us through that journey and given us an example of what local authorities can do right now, which won't just have a short-term impact in terms of the policies that they will be implementing right now within the context of the cost of living crisis, but also a long-term impact, being aware of the socioeconomic duty. And they're implementing it in Scotland. They have implemented it in Scotland and Wales, but there are a handful of local councils across the country, like Newcastle. I think Cambridge are considering it. Derby have said that they might consider it. We've got some in London. It's a really important way of thinking about structural inequalities. Yesterday, I was invited to City Hall, where the mayor launched the GLA structural inequality strategy. That was fantastic to see. It's fantastic to see that now we've got mayors interested in this broader issue of structural inequalities, because to be honest, until quite recently, it was just the responsibility of charities, equality charities like ours, and equality think tanks. So it's great to see that thought about how you mainstream inequality policies, how you mainstream that strategy is on everyone's mind. And we need that to be on business minds as well. Right, so we've come to Q&A, and I'm just trying to see if there are any questions from our audience. But while we wait, and I'll wait for any questions to be passed on to me from Imogen, while we wait, I wonder, with the speakers that we have, I wonder if I could just take you to today's Chancellor's statement. And you may not have had time. I mean, we are living it really live here, because the Chancellor literally came out with his new measures just a mere 3 hours ago. And in a way, those measures were a step in the right direction, because we had a Chancellor moving from package of measures in the context of cost of living crisis, which arguably were really more universal measures rather than targeted. And that's even though we know that targeted households, rather than low-income households, targeting it on low-income households. And that's even though we know that low-income households have higher inflation, have higher costs, food costs, energy costs, than higher income households. We know that. We've heard that from Resolution Foundation, we've heard that from IFS, we've heard that from NEF, we've heard that from many economists out there. And so the Chancellor has come out with some targeted measures. It looks like he's going to use the benefit system. But I want to ask each and every one of you, and I'm going to start with Helen, because you were last. Helen, has the Chancellor with the announcements made today, do you think the Chancellor has gone far enough with addressing structural inequalities? And if not, what more would just fair like to see this government doing?
I mean, I think how to answer that without asking if it's a trick question. In no way has a one-off payment gone far enough. And you'll maybe hear from my accent, but I'm from Northern Ireland. So in particular, with our lack of government at the minute, we're actually still, policy friends and I are still trying to figure out if we'll actually see the money in Northern Ireland, because no new spending policies can be made. So it does not go far enough. And I think we really do need to take that step back and re-examine things from a rights-based point of view. So who are the groups who are being most impacted? And as Zubaida said, you know, the cost of living crisis is not hitting people equally. The cost of living crisis is a lot more expensive for those who are at the sharpest ends of economic inequality. So I would love to see the socioeconomic duty. And one of the things that really excites me, as I said, about the socioeconomic duty is just the idea that people would have to sit when making decisions and really consider the impact that their decisions will be having on how people live their lives and what those lives are like. So I think that was really interesting as well. Come back to what Olivia was saying, in terms of like kids going on school trips, that can sound like such a, you know, off the cuff thing, but when you look at the important work that's been done around the cost of the school day, our kids are not all having the same experience of a school day, for example. And so just really sitting and thinking about how policies impact on a person's lived experience is, to me, such a powerful tool. So I could go on, but I'll stop there.
No, that's a very, very, very important point, I think. And once again, that takes us back to Celia's point, which is about thinking proactively rather than reactively. Celia, you may have noticed that the Chancellor said that there will be specific one-off payments for disabled groups as well. Is that going far enough?
I think it's a really good starting point, and it's good to see that, you know, like what you said, that there's been some specificity of we're looking down and we're getting down into the separate groups and actually working out what are the individual needs. And I think one of the things that's really, really important to always remember is the cost of living for disabled people is always much higher than it is for everybody else. So one-off payments are excellent, but we've got to remember that we already have additional costs that, you know, this is why we have PIP, which are non-means tested benefits, that it on average it's over £500 that a disabled person spends extra than the average person each month already. So the cost of living crisis is hitting us really, really hard. And I know it was Zubaida, we've spoken about this as well in other meetings, that COVID was a real opportunity where actually everybody got a glimpse of what it was like to almost be disabled, by everybody being stuck in their homes, everybody not able to go to work, everybody, you know, facing the threat of losing their jobs. All of these things that we all experience should be a lesson for us moving forward. How can we take virtual learning? How can we take the accessibility measures that we seem to be able to very easily implement for everybody across the country? How can we implement those long-term for disabled people? So I think the announcement today is a really good starting point, but we need to be looking forwards to the future. This cost of living crisis isn't going anywhere in a short space of time. So what can we do to make sure that people are being protected in 6 months' time, not just now? And I think that's really important to remember.
Thank you. You're absolutely right. Yes. And actually, Helen, that leads me nicely onto you, which is, given what you were saying about the link between mental health and financial issues, and that's a vicious circle. Are one-off payments to those in low-income households, is that going to be enough?
So today's announcement doesn't tackle structural inequalities, but I do actually think there's quite a lot to be celebrated in there. And I'm not normally somebody who would be celebrating an awful lot about what's happened lately in government policy, but the recognition of higher costs for disabled people is not something that happens very often in government responses, you know, in kind of economic statements. So I think that is important. The fact that a lot of the support, so the £650 is attached to means tested benefits, makes it a more progressive response to the cost of living crisis than we've seen so far. So it is targeting more money at those of lower incomes through the benefit system rather than providing a grant that is the same for everybody. But what it doesn't do is tackle systemic inequalities. But to be fair, I don't think it was intended to do that. Because I don't think the government has quite accepted the case that that is something that they should be doing right now. I think what it does is provides some financial support to people now in this crisis. And the fact that some more of that financial support is targeted at people with greater needs is a good thing. But in terms of the mental health impacts, a one-off payment can provide some help to people. We did some research about 2 weeks ago looking at the psychological impact of the cost of living crisis, and it's unsurprisingly appalling. So we found 1 in 5 adults say that they are unable to cope as a result of the cost of living crisis. That's a pretty strong statement. That's 11 million people in the UK who say that right now they are really struggling to cope. And much higher numbers of people say that they're feeling anxious and depressed. So, and part of that was tied to the uncertainty of not knowing if any help was coming and not knowing how bad things were going to get. So setting out this plan of what is going to happen will provide some reassurance to some people, but it's not enough to address the long-term poverty and disadvantage that people have been facing. And for many people with mental health problems are 3 times as likely to be in problem debt. For many people, those one-off payments will just be sunk into debt repayments and they'll never actually see any of the cash to increase their standard of living. It will just disappear immediately on arrival. So no, it's not enough, but I think there is something about it that we should acknowledge is a step in a better direction.
Yes, and I think you're absolutely right that we do need to, reinforce the positive steps, reinforce the steps in the right direction, reward that so that the Chancellor does more, which actually brings me nicely on to a question that we have from our audience, which is around welfare policy. I'm just trying to find it again, which is around welfare policy and whether we call it welfare. It's had so many different names, hasn't it? It's gone from social security to welfare to benefits, all of which, of course, has been quite strategic from a comms perspective, from what should be seen as a safety net to something that is given. But in terms of welfare policy, can I just quickly ask each of you, very quick answers if you don't mind, our welfare policies, is our current safety net adequate at the moment? Adequate in terms of how much people get, adequate in terms of access? And if not, just from your, I mean, it's a broad question, but just from your own areas, what more would you like to see in terms of changes to the benefit system? We know from example, from the food banks, that the benefit system, that universal credit is one of the reasons why there have been such high number, and the reform to the benefit system, why there have been such a high number going to food banks. But can I just start from you once again, Helen? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, and I would actually say that, we would take the position that the United Kingdom has signed up to the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights back in the 70s, which guarantees the right to social security, is how they phrase it, and the right to an adequate standard of living for every person within the UK. That's not every citizen, that's every person in the UK. So the UK has agreed to be legally bound by that. It doesn't have domestic jurisdiction, unfortunately, so we can't take them to court, but there is a legal obligation there and it is not being met. I would also, though, say that my concept of what social security about is that it's beyond just the safety net. Social security and an adequate standard of social security is a social good and something that should, if done properly, increase the health of our society, the both mental and physical health, the healthy life expectancy of our society, the education standards, like all these things that are supported by adequate social security and an adequate standard of living, for me, really pushes it beyond being a safety net. And you can just, I mean, we have experts in the many different areas on the call who can speak better than I can about the multiple ways in which people's rights and people's needs are being failed. But for me, again, coming back to that human rights-based approach, everybody, and this kind of taps into that social model of disability, although I'd more, again, being from where I'm from, go for a human rights model. Everybody should have the ability to exist in the world on an even playing field. And it is the duty of governments and public authorities and us as a society more widely to put the things in place that are necessary for that to happen. If we recognize that structural inequalities are like human-made phenomenon, then the solution to it is also human-made. So I'm very much more probably taking a more kind of less detailed approach and more philosophical. So I'll pass over probably to some of my amazing fellow panel members for a bit more of a specific answer.
Yeah, it's a tricky question, so forgive me. But Helen Undy, do you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I suppose in a nutshell, no, our benefit system is not adequate. The level of benefits is too low for people to live on. Our level of sick pay is too low. Housing benefit is pegged at only 30% of average housing costs in your area, which is very difficult to find housing for many people that they can actually afford through their housing benefit. So there are many ways in which the level of benefits is inadequate for people to live on, but also the design and implementation of our benefit system disadvantages particularly people with disabilities, and we've really focused on people with mental health problems in our research. So we're actually running a campaign at the moment called Set Up to Fail, looking at the universal credit system, because I think it's really clear that when you look at the design of the universal credit system, from how you apply to and kind of access benefits in the first place through to how you manage your claim, just to take one example, you have to be able to open the post, make telephone calls, fill in online forms, navigate a website, attend appointments. Those are all things that the illness that you are receiving benefits to support you with. So you might be unable to work because you're living with mental health problems, because you are unable to take part in some of those activities. If you can't take part in those activities, you're likely to have your benefits sanctioned or cut off. There is a system by which you can set up a friend or a third party to help you manage your benefits. But again, in order to do that, you have to fill in an online form or make a telephone call, and it's very complicated. So we're campaigning to simplify that, but that is just one element of the benefit system. And actually there are many, many more elements that make it incredibly difficult for people to access, particularly when they're struggling with their mental health.
Yes, and I think that's a really important point, to talk about those barriers around accessing social security, and not only those barriers, but also criminalising any kind of what the government call fraud. And it isn't always fraud in terms of social security, where people fall into all sorts of errors because of the system, but they're criminalised because of it. I think there's lots of issues there. Celia,
yeah,
how do you feel about the welfare state, about the current social security at the moment, and what it looks like and whether it's enough?
I think from a disability perspective, one of the biggest causes of concern that we have is testing methods and qualifying criteria. So if we look at PIP, for example, it's not means tested. I mean, the stories that I can give you that I've heard of people that have been through the PIP processing system, I remember for my test, it was done by an 18-year-old who's fresh out of university, had no medical experience, and he asked me to demonstrate how I couldn't unbutton my shirt. And those are the kind of experiences that are happening everywhere, that we really need to look at how we are assessing universal credit, how we are assessing PIP claimants and other disabilities. But also there's we need to also be recognizing the fluctuating nature of certain health conditions and how quickly sometimes health conditions can develop. So talking about going back to what Helen Undy was saying about mental health conditions, you know, some mental health conditions can develop very, very quickly, you know, whether that be through a bereavement or through a traumatic experience, that we need to be speeding up how we are implementing and how quickly we are getting help to people. Yes, you get back payments. You know, if you've just been diagnosed with something that could be potentially life-changing, or you've been in an accident and you've got 3 children to feed and a family to think about, it can sometimes take weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks to happen. And when we're looking at housing benefits, where they change the structuralities of your housing, so putting in ramps and things like that, a recent report came out that some people are waiting 1.5 years for that to happen. Well, if you're a new wheelchair user and you can't actually leave your own property, even though you are receiving the help you need, the length of time that it's taking to get that help, you know, is devastating your life for 1.5 years. So we really need to be looking at the means testing and actually making sure that the people that are testing have an understanding of the fluctuating nature of a disability. We saw all these things on the news of, you know, people taking photographs of, I saw her at the supermarket, you know, she was walking out her cane the other day. That doesn't mean to say that that health condition has gone, but that condition could be fluctuating. I'm an ambulatory wheelchair user, which means I sometimes use my chair and sometimes don't. And the look on people's faces when I get out of my chair and be like, oh my God, her legs work. Yes, not every person in a wheelchair, you know, can't walk, but it's that real attitude that, okay, she's using her wheelchair because she's being lazy, or like she can walk, so she doesn't need this accessibility measure in place, you know, she'd just like it. And it's that change of perception around disability, and it all stems back to education and awareness about understanding the day-to-day lives of people.
Thank you. Really important points there around the fluctuating nature of health, mental health, around dignity, which is particularly important. There are certain words that are really sticking in my mind. I don't know about you. Mary, you have been so patient. You have had that hand up for a while. I'm a terrible chair. So can I quickly bring you in? We've only got a few minutes left, Mary, but I want you to be able to ask a question. Please go ahead.
Just 2 things. I think it's fairly recently, it must have been the Conservatives that did it, that if you have a 3rd child, you don't get any benefit, which seems absolutely bonkers. And I know about this because when I was a child, my mother was Irish. They met in the war. They had 9 children. You didn't get benefit for the first, but for 8 children, they got benefit. Goodness knows how they would have managed without it. But it's, you know, what's the point? Are they trying to punish people? Are they trying to reduce the population? What's going on? The second thing is nobody's mentioned UBI, and it would save. I know that getting PIP it has to be on top because it needs the extra help that people need. But they are spending so much money on all these procedures of people having to apply and assessing them and all these communications. It's rubbish jobs. Haven't you heard of UBI? Nobody's mentioned it. Okay, those are the 2 questions.
Good for you, Mary. I like the passion there in your voice, and I'm sorry. I am so sorry that we have this kind of situation. Pascal, I do want to bring you in, so I'm going to try and squeeze you in just before the end, because I do want to ask you a quick question. But extremely quickly, do our speakers want to answer? Does anybody feel that they could answer Mary's question around about the 3rd child in the benefit system no longer receiving benefits, and what that says? If anybody doesn't feel like they want to answer, Helen Flynn, do you think that there is a philosophical answer to this question?
I mean, the 2-child cap, as we kind of call it, is clearly a breach of rights of the child, because as you mentioned, Mary, the idea of child benefit was to ensure that children had a decent standard of living, and particularly there's need for that in larger families at times. And coming from Northern Ireland, we still have larger families than the average family in England, so it is a particular issue here. I can only think that it's an ideological issue about punishment for people that they see as being irresponsible. That's not to, I really reject the idea of deserving and undeserving, but it completely does not allow for things like people who have children and, financially are doing okay, and then, life happens and things change and those children being punished. Or I believe there may be issues in terms of, and I'm not sure of the term for it, but if you take over care, for example, of relatives and stuff, so your younger siblings for whatever reasons, or nieces or nephews, if you have to take their care, I don't think they ever sorted that out. So it's something that directly impacts on the rights of the child, but also it's something that is a massive issue in terms of discrimination against women, because we also know that it massively impacts upon women, because most single parents are indeed women. So I can see no other justification for it other than an ideological one, and an ideological one that's massively flawed. And I mean, it's not making families smaller, if that's what they wanted to do. I believe the Church of England and Joseph Rowntree came out with this study a few months ago that showed that. In terms of UBI, it's definitely one way to achieve an adequate standard of living. I don't know enough about the details of it, which is why I wouldn't try to jump into it, but we're up for anything that
for the benefit of our for the benefit of everyone else, could you just tell us what UBI is, please?
UBI is a universal basic income. So the idea is that people would have a certain set income, irrespective, well, there's different models to achieve it, but the model that I imagine, Mary, you're probably talking about is irrespective of means testing, irrespective of your situation. So things like the grants that are given, for example, during coronavirus in Northern Ireland, we did have like £100 spend local card, and that was seen as kind of some form of UBI for a very temporary shot measure of stimulating the local economy and just giving people that little bit of extra money. So yeah, anyway.
You. Thank you. I'm sorry I have to cut you off. Right, I have got 2 minutes left. Pascal, I want to give you, I am so sorry, I'm going to give you, I'm afraid it's about 30 seconds. Would you like to say, as Olivia had to leave, would you like to add anything in relation to no recourse for public funds and the safety net?
Thanks so much, Zubaida. I wanted to add a small point, because you mentioned new migrants a few times. This policy affects up to 2 million people in the UK. Over 1 in 10 people affected by no recourse to public funds have been here over a decade. And that's because of the long amounts of settlement you have to accrue to get permanent residency here. Nadine El-Anani talks about immigration policies as a way to control and punish particularly racialized communities. And I think that it's, of course, disgusting, but I think we can be really proud of coming together today to hearing about all of the different ways that various different types of inequalities affect us systematically. And it's campaigning like this, it's coming together, it's building broad coalitions that we can change what the government thinks it can do to us, essentially. And today's budget, whether it's acceptable or not acceptable, it has only come into place because of campaigners. And just to say, for anyone here, please continue using a variety of tactics, and please get in touch and reach out, because we would love to work together with everyone here to change this.
Thank you so much, and sorry about the dog. He's had another dog. I wanted to wrap up nicely and say a bit more, but I'm going to keep it really short. I'm going to say thank you to our fantastic speakers who joined us today, who covered quite a few of the issues, and particularly the long-term systemic issues that are holding back key groups in society. We had Celia talking about the minority of disabled groups in this country, but it occurred to me that actually, if she's talking about 1/5 of the population being disabled, then that's bigger than Scotland and Wales put together, which you should keep in mind. there's lots to think about, but I want to say thank you to all of you. I want to say thank you to those of you who joined us. That really matters. Turning up matters. And I want to say thank you to my team, Cerise Goodhead and Imogen, where are you, Imogen? And Imogen, Richmond Bishop, who helped to set this webinar up, and they put a lot of hard work and thought into it. So thank you to you all. Please do keep an eye out on our Twitter, and please do look up our Structural Inequalities Alliance on our website. We're looking to expand it all the time, and we're going to be carrying on. We're going to be covering lots more issues in the near future. So once again, thanks again, stay safe, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you, everyone. Bye.